Kia ora koutou and welcome to your regular weekly video. This week we're talking about our phones, and this video complements chapter 9 of your textbook, I Love My Phone, Technology and Social Networks. I'm sure most, if not all of you, have a smartphone. In fact, some of you probably have an eye on yours right now at the same time as you're watching this video. If you do have a smartphone, you're not alone. The World Internet Project reported in 2018 that 70% of us in this country own a smartphone, up from 48% in 2013. So this week we're going to look at our phones and our phone use. There are two big ideas I want to work through. The first is about the power of social groups. We've already been there when we talked about shopping and consumer culture. But this time I want to delve a little deeper into the emerging tension between group solidarity and social isolation that emerges in any discussion of the smartphone. There are a few key concepts that I'll introduce to help us along the way: social capital, social networks, homophily, and moral panic. The second big idea is about the increasing importance of virtual communities and the way these have changed how we do social life. Here we'll be thinking about how we might use technologies such as our iPhones and the online space they give us access to create social change. So let's get started by first reflecting on the power of the iPhone to produce either social capital or social isolation. There are some who argue that the smartphone means we are more connected than we have ever been. Our devices enable a range of social activities, from the boring and mundane to the politically charged. We can keep in touch with friends and family, we can disseminate our political views in the lead up to an election, and we can share photos of what we had for dinner. The concept of social capital is useful for thinking about this. You'll recall that social capital is one of three forms of capital introduced by Bourdieu, the other two forms being economic and cultural. In this context, social capital refers to the connections, information those connections bring, and social relationships you can call on that can help to expand and capitalise on your social networks. Of course, on social media, we might have hundreds, if not thousands, of Facebook friends and Twitter followers. But what do these social networks provide you with? What kind of social capital do they provide? Back in the mid-1970s, Granovetter noted a distinction between strong ties and weak ties when it comes to our social networks. Strong ties are those people we know very well, friends and close family, for example, who we can call on for support in a variety of situations, in fact in any situation. But weak ties, random acquaintances for example, are also useful, he argues, because they can help to generate different kinds of opportunities that can potentially lead to increased forms of other kinds of capital. So we hear about a cool new well-paying job because our Facebook friend posted the ad, and in fact our virtual, often weakly tied online communities can even compensate for a lack of social capital in the offline world. And collectively, some argue that the presence of our social networks, whether we have strong or weak ties, will protect us from social isolation, from anomie, that instability that emerges within a society that's lost its shared standards and values. Primarily, this is because our online community can connect us around specific interests and social groups, which can be especially useful for marginalised groups as it creates a shared online community to connect and build connections. But who's in our networks? Is it a case of birds of a feather flock together, or do opposites attract? Homophily is an interesting concept that refers to our tendency to form bonds with those who are most like us. So yes, birds of a feather stick together. We build on the existing networks we already have in place, so they effectively become self-perpetuating. So getting back to our networks in the world of social media, there's considerable evidence that homophily can be problematic in some contexts, because we surround ourselves with those who share our values, interests, and political views. This means that when social issues arise and hit the world of social media, we're surrounded by those espousing the same positions as us. So we end up with an epistemic bubble where we don't hear opposing arguments, so our ideas, our values, our thoughts are perpetually repeated back to us and reinforced. Or we end up with an echo chamber, where we don't trust those with political positions opposed to our own, so we seek to actively discredit those positions. Neither outcome is particularly good for a liberal democratic society. So that's one of the negative aspects of the online world. So let's finish this section by talking about the fear-mongering and hand-wringing that seems to surround any debate about the ubiquity of smartphones and the online world it connects us with. Sociologists describe this hand-wringing as a moral panic. Moral panic is a term coined by Stanley Cohen back in 1972 and refers to the anxiety that emerges in society when a new phenomenon comes along that challenges how things have always been, how society hangs together. So we saw a moral panic emerge in response to video games. People were concerned that video games were disturbing young people's minds and that at best it would lead to an obesity epidemic because young people wouldn't get the exercise they once did, and at worst would lead to increased levels of violence as young people enacted the images they were exposed to in games. So there was a great deal of concern expressed in both public and private spheres. In the context of smartphones and social media, a moral panic has emerged because there's increased anxiety that smartphones and the fact that people don't seem to be able to live without them is getting in the way of real, so-called, face-to-face relationships. There's concern that they're diminishing our attention spans. There's concern that they're disrupting our sleep patterns. There's concerns that they're diluting the quality of our relationships. Ultimately, there's concern that smartphones and the online world they connect us with are destroying the very fabric of society. So what do you think? Is a moral panic justified? Well, before you decide, I want to reflect on some of the ways that social media has been used as a tool for solidarity, social justice, and social change in ways that cross geographical, social, and cultural borders. In a study of the Black Lives Matter movement and the influence of social media, researchers Munt, Ross and Burnett found that social media created possibilities for building connections, mobilising people and resources, coalition building, and sharing stories of racism and discrimination experienced by people of colour in ways that challenged dominant negative stereotypes. And since 2017, the Me Too movement provided a digital platform for survivors of rape and sexual assault to share their experiences and collectively generate a new culture of publicly calling out rape culture, misogyny, and harassment, no matter who the perpetrator. Again, like the Black Lives Matter movement, we see the Me Too movement leaping across geographical borders as the world's population started to take note of systemic crimes against women. And of course, social media has also been used locally following the tragic events of Christchurch, providing a platform for people to share their grief, mourning and outrage, demonstrate solidarity with the Muslim community, and raise funds for victims and their families. So two concepts or terms have emerged in the context of digital activism: clicktivism and slacktivism, often used interchangeably. Clicktivism and slacktivism can be defined as the practice of supporting a political or social cause by means such as social media or online petitions, and is characterised as involving very little effort or commitment. Such charges are often made by those who are used to traditional forms of activism that quite literally involve putting one's body on the line. But given the kind of global traction online activism can generate, I'm not convinced we can ignore this development. One of the things I haven't discussed in this video is the material conditions of your phone's production. You can read about the exploitative working conditions embedded in the global supply chain of smartphones in your textbook. You can also read about the environmental degradation and civil war in which your smartphone is implicated. So, my departing question is, how do you reconcile your desire for mobile communication with the environmental and labour market exploitation? You might like to post your thoughts on our stream site. Until then, have a good week.